As you roll in, as per usual, please tell us where you're from in the world. Every time I do this, I say if you're in the Caribbean, Anton and I will come. We'll do this talk in person. We'll stay in a nice five-star hotel,
Yep.
Huntress budget, of course.
Yes.
Oh, San Antonio. San Antonio's got
Awesome.
the spirit of the Caribbean, Garrett. You know?
A
Some
little
people have
bit.
described it as the Caribbean of the States. So maybe we'll we've got quite a few analysts in San Antonio, actually.
Tampa. Oh, that's nice. Oh,
Yeah.
Fort Myers, St.
Florida. I mean,
Mary's.
listen, man, Florida's right next to Caribbean. We could just do a little
Yeah.
swim. Baltimore is decidedly not the Caribbean of the United States, Max. Oh, we got someone from Ontario. So
Ontario.
for
There you
folks
go.
that
My
don't
neck of the
know,
woods.
Anton is Canadian. Don't hold that against him for now, please.
Yes. Please don't. Yes.
Yeah, actually, we're going to add a 20% tariff, Anton, on every webinar you come into, man.
Oh no. And then I'll counter that tariff with a 50% tariff, and then
Oh man. Well, look, it's all love here in the chat, folks. This is a tariff-free webinar. There'll be zero tariffs. Someone's from Slovenia. Well, listen, man, that's down the road. That's like
wow.
a 3 hour plane, 4 hours max. So could definitely do a Slovenia trip. We
Yeah.
have Michael saying hello from Wisconsin. Sorry,
Slovakia.
it's not Canada.
Hey, not everyone can be an awesome Canadian. That's fine.
From Hastings, New York. Do you know what always catches me out? That the States and Canada have the same names as places in the UK.
Yeah.
And I know
Yeah.
that's self-obvious. Like I know that. But then it's weird
Yeah.
that like I know Hastings in the UK and then I think of it there and it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
So yeah. But folks, as you're coming in, just make sure you've set your chat to everyone. If you only set it to hosts and panelists, then only Anton and I can see. You can do that if you want to send us secret notes, but we may embarrass you and tell everyone about it. You can also use the QA feature as well if you wanted to ask us something. We're pretty honest. We'll tell you everything. We'll even tell you things that we shouldn't about Huntress, which is fun. If you notice when you put QA, we can put things anonymized or put your name, it doesn't matter. And we can usually we'll answer questions if they're pertinent as we do the webinar, but sometimes we'll save them at the end, but we've not ignored you. Okay. We'll give it another minute and then we'll get started. Anton, I have seen nobody from the Caribbean. I'm disturbed.
I
I'm
know.
horrible.
That's we need to talk to our social team a little bit to see where they're targeting these webinars, what geographic locations, and whether they're warm enough or not.
Hmm. Oh man, we have people being like, whoa, no boring? Well, boring? And listen, it's going to be boring-ish. It's not boring tradecraft, okay? It might be, but we'll
Yeah.
make it. James Mason's like, hey, I'm going to go personally to the Caribbean and drum up some
Yes.
business.
Yes. Next webinar.
Hawaii vacation in a few weeks, Scott. Scott, maybe we could talk business in Hawaii. That
Yeah.
feels like a good place to, sign a good
Be happy to
Huntress.
give you some demos and yeah.
Manuel, Mexico. I mean, I'd go to Mexico. I
Yeah.
I would go to
Mexico's
Mexico. I'm
lovely.
cold right now. I'm
Yeah.
I'm in the UK. I'm freezing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's cold here too.
Yeah, but cool. Look, we'll get it
Although,
started, folks. This is
yeah.
fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. You're here for the most boring tradecraft of all time. This is going to be the most boring, terrible Tradecraft Tuesday that Huntress has ever. No, of course it's not. It's going to be interesting because Anton and I. So, for folks that don't know, you are joined by. Oh, today's agenda. I'll skip ahead and then I'll go back. You're joined by one of the most foremost thinkers in information security. Anton has
Thank you.
always just impressed me with his ability to write and explain incredibly complex things to monkeys like me. And you're joined by me, the monkey, who gets to just nod as Anton does wonderful things. And what we're going to do is we're going to take you through, all right, well, what is boring tradecraft, right? And we don't mean boring as in it's Yawnsville. We mean boring as in it's just very run of the mill, right? You look at it and go, yeah, that's not interesting. And we're going to put forward to you that most threat actors are not sophisticated. That's kind of going to be our manifesto. They're not sophisticated. 99% of them are doing the same things, copy pasting from the same playbooks. But we also want to give a little insight into that 1%, those who go a little bit above, boring into your VPN. Jeff, that was terrible.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Wow.
Terrible. We're going to elevate it by showing you times when threat actors take a boring platform but make it interesting. That would be fantastic. We're going to give you some examples, so we're going to get into that. But we want to leave you with some tips and takeaways. Not going to charge you, again, tariff-free, that we hope that you can end this webinar and you can just instantly go in action. The math that we have says if you take away a lot of our tips, you can usually decrease your chances of a cyber attack anywhere between 30 to 50%. That's nuts, right? That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's not even me
Yeah.
inflating the data. So that's fantastic. Cool. Anton, what is boring tradecraft?
Oh man. Yeah. This is so boring tradecraft could be a whole bunch of things, right? It could be boring from a certain perspective, meaning that, hey, you've personally kind of seen this kind of tradecraft a bunch of times. It could be boring in the sense that the industry as a whole kind of sees it a lot. Um, but I think in our case, boring tradecraft could mean a whole bunch of things. And I think that's in the next slide, if you will. So boring tradecraft could be impactful. It could be super impactful, especially things like a successful brute force. If you think about that, brute forcing is bread and butter. It's vanilla. Everyone does it. Everyone knows about it. But a successful brute force, super impactful. Boring tradecraft could also be just a nuisance, like a pain in the butt to deal with. And brute forcing is actually another example of that. Boring tradecraft can also be difficult to detect, difficult to stop, because in a lot of cases, what facilitates this kind of boring tradecraft is normal business operations, right? People need to connect to VPNs, people need to connect to remote desktop gateways, PCs need to be available for users, for doctors, for nurses, for everything like that. So just because it's boring doesn't mean that it is boring from all sides, right? It could be boring from the threat actor perspective, it could be boring from an incident response perspective, but definitely not from the victim perspective, right? So this kind of stuff is effective and it works, which is ostensibly why we keep seeing it everywhere. This is the kind of definition of boring, at least from our end. Um, so it doesn't need to be boring in the sense of like, hey, snooze fest boring. This could be boring in the sense of this is kind of like annoying. You know, we see this quite a bit, and frustratingly, we see it work quite a bit as well. So there's just a super interesting dynamic that we have here. That something can be, uh, not the 0 day of the month kind of thing, and not be like the super elite exploit. It could be just a simple stolen credential, credential stuffing, password spraying, brute force. But the impact of that is huge. So that is kind of like our nutshell definition of quote unquote boring tradecraft.
And you hit the nail on the head there, man. It's not about the O days. And I can see some people in chat being like, hey, does boring mean routine? Does boring mean run of the mill? That's exactly what we're putting forward. And the manifesto that we're putting forward here, and that I've sort of long held, is you shouldn't worry about the black swan events. Don't worry about O days. Don't think about them. The reason that it's not worth thinking about is that there's very little you can do. And if someone sells you a product telling you that their product stops 0 days, they're selling you snake oil, ignore them. And exactly, Robin, do the basics right. What we're putting forward here is that the boring and routine tradecraft is what 99% of these threat actors do. They are going to use playbooks sorry, my dog is about to bark. They're going to use playbooks that they just copy paste for. They're going to do the same things every time, and that gives us a defensive opportunity, right? That gives us a defensive opportunity to neutralize what they're up to, stop what they're doing. And what Anton and I hope to do by taking you to the end of this is, as long as you get the basics right, you'll catch it, you'll detect it, you'll neutralize it. But basics doesn't mean easy. Something that's simple doesn't make it easy to do. Okay?
Definitely, definitely. And
Had
the
to grab
fact that, yeah, that we have a special guest now. The webinar has got like 3 people. That's amazing. So the webinar is definitely not boring, even though the tradecraft could be. The one thing I'll add to the whole this whole like boring tradecraft dynamic too is that when the basics are done, the doing the basics well is kind of the thing that will give you the best chance at detecting those advanced threats, those advanced 0 days. So if you really want to kind of focus on that, and if that's kind of what gets your leadership's attention, right? So if you talk to your leadership, hey, I need this tool or these logs in this system because of brute forcing, maybe that won't have as much of an impact as if you say, hey, I need to stop the elite 0 days with this. But both are definitely applicable. So doing the basics will, even though they're called the basics, that all that will set you up for success when you're trying to deal with the kind of 0 days that we see a lot of.
Yeah, we do see one too many O days. Um, I
Definitely.
want to go through some examples though, because like we see a butt ton, and for folks that aren't too sure exactly how does Huntress see this, how do you know about this? So Huntress is an MDR, right? We have agents installed on machines ranging from Windows machines to Mac OS, but we also have a little plugin with M365, so identities. We also have SIM, right? And so when you put all of our telemetry together, sorry, when you put all our products together, you get a telemetry that can tell a story. And so we're able to look at what threat actors do as kind of a holistic story and playbook. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to take a salami slice of all these steps that they do in their playbook. And we wanted to share with you times when these threat actors are doing something, yeah, it looks boring if you just look at it, it's run of the mill. But what Anton has very kindly done for us is he's taken a little taste of each of these and found something quite interesting in them all. So again, these are routine. You can stop them with very routine defenses, but there are some threat actors doing that little bit more interesting thing. So let's take a look. Some of the examples, we're going to start with brute forcing. So I'll just quickly help people understand brute forcing. Um, if a product tells you, hey, we're going to tell you every time you're brute forced, whether that's your VPN, an identity, and you're going to think, oh, great, that's fantastic. I'm going to tell you that you don't want that. And the reason that you don't want that is threat actors are brute forcing 24/7 doesn't mean they're getting in. And something that I say is brute forcing isn't interesting. Successful brute forcing is fascinating. And exactly, Robin, brute force is just noise. There are port scans that come up as brute forces. There are very legitimate services that do brute forcing. But successful brute forcing? Well, now that's interesting. Anton, define VPN compromise for us. What does that mean? Does that mean ODE?
Not necessarily. We see a lot, actually too much VPN compromise. I'll put it that way. Way more VPN compromise than we would like to see. And in a lot of cases, we don't have evidence to support that the threat actor landed on that appliance via some kind of 0-day. What we see mostly is just your bread and butter stolen credentials, brute force of the VPN appliance, an account that had VPN or sorry, excuse me, MFA maybe temporarily disabled, and that temporary kind of paradigm turned into a permanent paradigm over time. So we see a lot of that. And in the slide deck, we have some more examples of some additional kind of fun that we've been seeing with these VPN appliances, because we've kind of been observing a trend where the threat actor will do more things to the VPN appliance itself when they actually land on it. We have some screenshots to show that. So pretty excited to kind of walk everyone through that.
Yeah, man. And I mean, folks are hitting on it in chat. They're saying, hey, so we're talking about VPNs with stolen creds and no MFA. Spoilers, yes.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
here's a quick tip ahead, right? If you tonight go and add the additional security layers available to your VPN device, so MFA, IP, allow listing, geolocation, you're going to stop nearly 30% of any cyber attack you could suffer this year. That's just based on the data we've got. So imagine that. If we just told you one little slither and we're 15 minutes in for free, imagine what you'll get if you stay throughout the whole webinar. It's fantastic. Let's talk about tunneling. So what this means is where a threat actor's broken in and they want to have a little bit more access to your environment. Maybe it's a persistent backdoor so that if you catch their initial access, they've got a little something squirreled away. But another reason threat actors can tunnel is they want to have a different kind of access, right? So just because they've gained shell only access, maybe they want to get a GUI, so they use RDP tunneling, all kind of interesting things. Huntress is very good at detecting that tunneling as well, because it would usually be persistent. Credential access, and like people go on and on about all the kind of ways that you could steal credentials, but like, what does it mean when we say, oh, threat actors steal credentials? Where are they stealing them from?
Yeah, it could be lots of places actually. I think when people hear credential access, especially in the cybersecurity realm, right, they think of like Kiwis right away, and they think of Mimikatz, that traditional kind of credential theft from the LSAS process. And we see like quite a bit of that, right? We see a lot of credential dumping from LSAS. We see a lot of credential dumping from the registry. But over the last couple of weeks and months, we've also seen threat actors go after different avenues of credentials. And I'm not talking about just browser cookies, even things like Wi-Fi passwords. We have some examples later to show you about that. So if we think of this in terms of like hunger, the threat actors are starving for credentials. They're looking in every single possible nook and cranny of your networks for credentials to kind of like hoover them up and put them on the dark web, et cetera, whatever else they do with these credentials. But they are very, I don't know the right word for this, maybe persistent, like a dog with a bone with these credentials. That we see quite a bit of credential access techniques. And all of that is kind of like facilitated by lateral movement, which leads nicely to the last bullet point.
And exactly what Anton said there. You're stealing creds as a threat actor because you want to pivot. And the main thing we see with lateral movement is once threat actors gain their credentials, they've kind of got the superpowers to move around networks because networks aren't that hostile, right? You'll often hear someone describe it as a flat network. What we would suggest is make your network a bit more full of friction, make it a bit more hostile. It doesn't stop lateral movement. But neutralizing lateral movement makes it harder for a threat actor to achieve their goal. Fantastic, they broke in. Fantastic, they stole credentials. But if they can't go anywhere and do anything, you've been inconvenienced. And exactly, Robin, segmentation is your friend. But look, we can't keep you away from the boring tradecraft any longer. We have to give you examples. And what I want to start by saying is what you're looking at here on the screen right now, before we even get into the details of it, is you're looking at Anton's fantastic work. And so what Anton's leveraged here is an infrastructure in Azure to put different data sets in conversation to bring results. And I think if there's something that the more technical folks in this chat would like to take away, it's sometimes you've got to step out to step in. Scrolling and looking at event logs, scrolling and looking at what a FortiGate device may or may not give you, it's going to drive you nuts. And you want to do this in a way that's scalable, consistent, and it just bubbles up the most interesting things for you. We could do that for you if you're rolling with Huntress. If you want to do it yourself, we'll give you all the ideas. We want to help folks. We don't want to make you feel like you have to purchase your way to having good security. But the number one thing that we'd suggest is don't sit there scrolling through Windows Event Viewer. It's going to drive you nuts. So Anton, I can see here it says something that says there's brute forcing, and then there's a successful logon from a known bad. What does that mean, man?
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting example. You could see kind of on the left-hand side, just the sheer kind of force of this brute force, right? Like 3,000 plus failed accounts. So in this case, what we observed is just, we loaded up the events, we looked at it, and we saw brute forcing, right, which is normal. And the thing that with brute forcing that people kind of tend to maybe overlook or forget is that for a lot of businesses, there's kind of like a lack of central management and central configuration of endpoints. So what we often find is endpoints have their Windows event log size configured to the default. And by default, that's about 20 megabytes, I believe. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong with that number. And 20 megabytes, if you're thinking about like a brute force of this kind of veracity, is maybe 5 minutes of brute forcing, maybe even less. So if you're kind of rolling with the default kind of event log configuration and you're not sending those logs to a SIEM, a brute force will fill up that event log super quickly. So you may think like brute force, easy, I got it. We have strong passwords, it's okay. It may not be just the brute force itself that's the issue. It may be that the brute force actually gets in the way of investigating something else that's happening too, because that log is filled up, it rolled over, and it's just noise and brute force. So that's kind of like one thing about brute forcing. The other thing with brute forcing is that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to spot in networks, believe it or not, because of things like vulnerability scanner, management tools, and things like that. These kind of tools have credentials to your network, right? And ostensibly they're scanning for default creds in the network, right? So we see a lot of cases where an account named scanner or scanning is being brute forced, but is that being brute forced because of the scanning device, right? Or is it being brute forced because that scanning credential was stolen? And we've kind of had that go both ways, right? Sometimes we see that those creds were indeed stolen, which is bad because that vulnerability scanner has access to your whole network, right? And in other cases, we've seen cases where that scanning is actually legitimate. It's coming from a vulnerability scanner. That vulnerability scanner is looking for default credentials, and in that process, it's generating these kinds of brute force attacks. The successful part of it is also interesting, right? That's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, where you see login failure, login failure, login failure, and then all of a sudden, oh, login successful. And this kind of thing is pretty telling when we analyze these kinds of logs. We see it quite a bit. We also see brute forces from accounts like you see on the right-hand side that just don't exist in the network. So as we mentioned earlier, these actors are typically following a playbook. They typically have user accounts and passwords that they've probably gotten through other breaches that they're trying to authenticate with on your network. So the difference in the brute force, whether it's a login that doesn't exist or whether it's a login that's failed because of the password error or because of time of day restrictions, all that is just super valuable information to have when you're doing these kinds of investigations, because even though it feels a little bit nitty gritty, there's a big difference between those kinds of events.
And so when we talk about brute forcing as a weapon that the threat actor brings out in their toolkit, the reason that it's deployed, the reason that we call it boring is because it works. Threat actors have no need to come up with 0 days. They have no need to try and do very sophisticated fishes to get into your network because they can just go to your open RDPs, your VPNs, go to your email identities, do whatever they want, and just keep running, keep trying credentials. And now folks will say, okay, cool, that's fine. I actually have IP ignore deny listing if there are successive failures. Threat actors have become relatively interesting and they've started to do sort of IP hopping proxies, all these kinds of things to be able to brute force you without these systems being able to register that they're coming from the same one IP. And we see this again and again and again. Another really easy one. Okay, you've done deny listing for Russia, because of course you did. Why wouldn't you? They're just going to rent VPS space in Florida, right? Like and if you deny list them there, they're just going to spin up another thing. So you want to come up with something a little bit more interesting. And we've had someone have a question saying, "Hey man, what are you seeing more, brute forcing or password spraying?" I think the latter may be more prevalent. Yeah, I mean, I think we see a fair balance of, but
Yeah,
we're
I
seeing
agree with that.
instances where, sorry, go on, Anton.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I agree with that. The balance. Yeah.
We see a balance of both. I think it depends on the telemetry, it depends on the product, it depends who's trying to do it. We have some threat groups who we see and we monitor who I'm pretty sure all they do all day is just run Hydra and just brute force as many things as they can, as much as they can. And then we have others who are doing something a little bit more targeted. They're trying to get credentials for an organization based on breaches and data dumps. They're going and finding users that are, you can use various tools that just scrape your website, scrape your LinkedIn and look for your employees, try different username combinations. As you know, there's only so many ways that Windows or rather AD and Azure will let you put username combinations. And they're doing a targeted kind of spray, right? But I think those are the minority. The vast majority of threat actors are opportunists, I think. And yeah, we've got someone here, name of company. That's exactly it, man. That's all they're doing. Oh, I've skipped ahead. Sorry. Anton, any more on brute forcing before we take folks over to what brute forcing can look like on the other side on the VPN?
Yeah, let's keep going. I think we
Yeah, man.
brute forcing enough.
Brute force out. So something I wanted to point folks to, there have been a number of VPN providers over the years who have I'm trying to not get sued, created less than adequate devices. And I just want to spend a minute talking about VPNs and what I'm just going to generally refer to as gateway devices. All right. And the reason I'm going to refer to them as gateway devices is, believe it or not, I don't really care what the provider has told you this is going to do because they're actually doing a number of different things sandwiched together. And that's what we see on our end. And so when we see VPN logs, we're actually seeing firewall logs. We're seeing DNS reputation, DNS handling, like these are all packaged together. A huge disbenefit of doing security this way is, I guess, yes, from an IT perspective, it's probably quite easy to have one device with centralized logs kind of doing this. But from a security perspective, and Anton hinted at this earlier, these devices can't log for their life. So what I mean is, we have seen within, I think yesterday it was 9 minutes. Every 9 minutes, a VPN device, I'm not going to name names, a gateway device was rotating and overwriting its own logs. That's terrifying. What we also saw through some threat intel is that some threat actors were clearing the VPN logs. That's terrible. Because now what we've got is we've got situations where Anton and I won't know, hey, did a threat actor clear these logs and that's why we can't see much from this? Or did a VPN provider just create a default storage log that doesn't adequately serve a purpose? So it's really hard and difficult sometimes to do VPN-based investigations. Threat actors are probably just brute forcing to get their way into most of the VPNs that we see. Most of the VPN compromises we see happen with no MFA. There have been 3 times we have seen a particular MFA provider in use for a gateway device, and we believe those have been based on misconfigurations and not based on threat actor bypasses. So, super easy tip, just go and get MFA. But Anton, what we're looking at here isn't based around VPN logs not being adequate or MFA. We're looking at something a little bit different and maybe something a little bit interesting.
Yeah, yeah, this is definitely one of the more interesting VPN cases we had. And we've been reviewing these kinds of logs for a number of months now. And for the start of that period, what we observed is just malicious logins to the VPN. And what I mean by that is a login that doesn't fit, the normal authentication pattern of a user, right? So instead of a Comcast ISP, they're using Cloviter or DigitalOcean or something like that. Something that definitely sticks out as malicious. And over the last couple months and weeks, we've actually been noticing not just a login to the VPN, not just a malicious login to the VPN that leads to an internal network. We've actually been noticing kind of modifications of the VPN appliance itself. So in this case, they're modifying the firewall policy to allow some ports that weren't previously allowed by this firewall. They're also in the bottom screenshot there, they're actually enabling the guest account. And my guess here is that they're doing this for persistence purposes, just they don't have to, potentially lose their access. So this kind of thing is pretty worrying, at least for me personally, because as I've said, previously we've observed, yeah, okay, someone logs into the VPN, they get access to the internal network, and off they go. But in these cases, they're actually like modifying the VPN appliance themselves. They're clearing the logs, they're adding users, they're modifying the firewall policy, and I think that is actually pretty terrifying, right? If you all of a sudden you're working under the assumption that okay, yeah, SMB is blocked from the internet or something like that, and then all of a sudden it's not, and you're scrambling to figure out why that is, and you're pulling out your charts for how your network is configured and all that, because we kind of say like, okay, yeah, VPN is in front of the network, but there's a bunch of nuances to where that VPN is, how it authenticates to your network, and all these different things. So there's a bunch of variation here, which makes this kind of tradecraft, at least personally for me, very scary. And I saw somewhere in the chat, I think it was Brandon who asked, why is that? Why no MFA? And it's a really good question. And I think the reason for that is just ease of use, right? You may kind of orientate yourself towards the F10s where MFA is mandated and that you'll fail an audit if you don't have MFA. And your users are kind of used to that. They're used to authenticating with MFA. But in a lot of the businesses that we deal with, it could be a factory floor, a dental office, a financial office where the user and that enablement of MFA for that user might add too much friction to do their job. And if we kind of step back for a moment, right, business exists to make money, right? To run the business, they don't exist solely to keep themselves secure, unfortunately. I know that's a little bit kind of like a difficult concept for us security professionals to kind of wrap our heads around, and it is for me as well. So as much as I would love to really mandate, 100% and really like whack the knuckles, so to speak, of users who don't enable MFA on their VPN, there's actually, in a lot of cases, very, very good reasons why that MFA is not enabled per the account.
And the thing that I'd point to as well, so yeah, people in chat are saying, okay, but like security events will be expensive. It's hard sometimes until a threat has manifested to kind of demonstrate, hey, there was a financial impact to this. The thing that I always point to is try to figure out what industry you're in, try to figure out or what we're trying to protect, try to identify some threat groups that are known to target it, go and find a comparable industry and be like, all right, man, they were ransomed for potentially up to 50 million. I want a budget of like 5 million. Like, can we make that work? This like that those are ways that you can try and get the comparison. But I want to keep us trucking because I want us to talk a little bit about threat actors who have broken in. Okay, fantastic, that's great. But what are they doing when they're in? So the reason that threat actors tunnel, and we're going to sort of use tunnel to be analogous for persistence for a minute. Why do they want to tunnel? Why do they want to persist? Well, Anton brought up a great point. Sometimes threat actors are going to break in and they're just going to make sure they enable guest accounts. They're going to make sure that they've just got another way so that if you neutralize one path, they've got another attack path ready to leverage. What you're looking at here on the screen is you've got two examples, one using SSH and the other using ngrok. Now, neither of these two are particularly, I would say, like incredibly novel. Threat actors are trying to do this all the time. But what I do think is interesting is the way that they're leveraging tunneling. Let's talk a little bit why they're leveraging tunneling the way that they're leveraging it. So the first thing is if you write reverse shell.exe and you have it reach out to a Tor address, yeah, you're gonna get caught on that straight away. right? But I'm gonna hazard a guess, and I know because it took, I remember the hack the box machine that I learned SSH tunneling on, that not everyone is super comfortable and familiar with what every single flag of an SSH tunnel does. I don't. I have to reread the SSH manuals a couple times. Threat actors know that. They're not stupid. They also know that SSH is used legitimately in environments for lots of different things. Now, if you're like, hey, I don't use SSH, that's great. I would encourage you to deny list it tonight. Just go ahead and deny list it. You can do that through the process and software approach. You can do that through the firewall approach. That's fine. I don't mind. But lots of users do use this legitimately. And we even see it at Huntress. It's so routine as part of legitimate functionality and abused functionality, it can be really hard to discern. We have seen folks legitimately use SSH to DigitalOcean spaces that I've been like, no, only threat actors use DigitalOcean. What are we talking about? Nope. And devs do too. And so part of the danger of tunneling is threat actors are abusing legitimate functionality to do some of their tunneling. They are taking things that are part of Windows infrastructure and using it against you for that purpose. But the other thing you're looking at as well here, so if that covers the SSH, let's talk about ngrok. Ngrok's wild, man. When I first saw ngrok, I was like, this is terrifying because what you're able to do here is you're able to break in and then you're able to expose RDP or anything you kind of want for further access. But like, why would you do that? Well, because it makes stealing and clicking around easier. I don't want to just use shell. I want to use a GUI. And if I can set up a tunnel to do that, then that means, well, I don't have to enable loud registry keys. I don't have to do any of that. I can just set up ngrok. Anton, what do you think when you see ngrok? And what do you think of this case? Because they didn't just break in and use ngrok. They're also doing something else with the little lateral stuff.
Yeah, in this particular case, they were moving laterally, yeah. And I think they were actually moving laterally internally via RDP for this case. The other interesting part here is the staging directory. You typically don't see ngrok running from your perf logs directory. That's a very kind of like interesting piece of tradecraft. Ngrok is a super powerful dev tool, but it's very dangerous in the hands of threat actors because it just allows you to do, networking voodoo that you just wouldn't be able to accomplish either. Regarding SSH, I do want to make one point here. Before I joined Huntress, I did a lot of purple teaming for organizations, and SSH would be one of my favorite techniques to test. And the reason for that is because people forget that SSH is a protocol, not just a port. So what we would often ask is, hey, do you have SSH blocked on the firewall level? And we were told, yeah, of course. Yeah, we do, of course. So cool. I run my SSH server. I decided to listen on port 23 instead of 24 or another port or port 80 or 443. And off we go. Bob's your uncle. You got your SSH tunnel. You can bypass different firewall controls, potentially like even WAF and content filtering controls with SSH. So if you're looking at blocking SSH, definitely remember it's not just a matter of blocking port 22. You have to block the actual protocol SSH on your firewall if the firewall supports that. But yeah, ngrok, SSH, tunneling, see that quite a bit. And I know that there's a tendency to kind of like view this kind of tradecraft as bread and butter and vanilla, but there's so many different ways that it could be used and abused that it turns into a very kind of dangerous paradigm where you're almost like the VPN editing, right? Where your entire network perimeter that you spend so much time designing can be bypassed completely just with SSH. So anytime that kind of tradecraft pops off where you can kind of like bypass a control that you've audited that you put in place, that's something worth calling out. So even though we see it quite a bit, even though yes, it's boring, it's very, very impactful. Just like brute forcing and just like the VPN compromise, especially if they're actually editing the firewall config on your VPN. Very similar dynamic here where they might not be editing the firewall config, you know, on the appliance itself, but they're getting around your firewall config using SSH and tools like ngrok. So it's very, very similar dynamics.
Yeah, that's terrifying. You're using SSH that way. I'm glad that you work for the good guys and not the bad guys. There's a couple of people that work here. I'm like, I'm really glad you're not criminal, because that would be
Definitely.
terrifying. And so we talked a little bit. Okay, threat actors break in, they steal credentials elsewhere. But what about when they make landfall and they want to steal credentials here? And so, Anton, what are we looking at here, man?
Yeah, so this is your standard kind of flavor of credential access. This is what anyone who's ever taken like any kind of pen testing course, your pen test 101s, will be familiar with credential dumping from the registry and Mimikatz, right? We see on the right-hand side, the open source developer signature that we all kind of know and love from Mimikatz. So we see this quite a bit. And actually, if you look at the command line for those Mimikatz execution, which I hope it's visible on the slides, you can kind of see that they're not just grabbing the LSAS credentials, right? They're using almost every feature that Mimikatz has, right? So like, do we want credentials? Yes, tick, yes, they definitely do. What's also interesting here is that this is from the same case. So they're using the reg dump from Mimikatz, and they're also using another tool to dump credentials via the registry. So they're really hungry, as I mentioned earlier, for credentials. They really want these credentials, even to the point of using two different tools to get literally the same credentials from the registry, which I found interesting. Same with the command line here for Mimikatz. Usually you see the LSA dump logon passwords, command line parameter. You might see some vault ones, but why they want the boot key for this particular case, I don't know. It could be a playbook, it could be something else, but definitely interesting. Definitely something, again, that can be labeled as boring credential access, but definitely not, especially if you think about it from the perspective of especially local administrator credentials. These are dangerous, very, very dangerous, especially if they're actually shared across your network. What we often hear is, okay, yeah, the threat actor got credentials from this endpoint, but this particular endpoint is used rarely, doesn't have any sensitive information on it, and that might be the case. However, the local administrator credentials on that endpoint, if they work everywhere else in your environment, and if those local admin creds work for your domain controller as well, and your file servers, then that endpoint compromise leads almost directly to the compromise of your potentially your entire network. So credential access, yeah, boring for sure, but heavily, heavily impactful, especially if you don't have a lot of controls in place for things like lateral movement and segregation that we talked about earlier.
It's worth noting that Anton brought up a great point. Like, if you look at this being run, this is like baby's first like hack, right? Because they barely renamed Mimikatz. And I want to be honest, most threat actors don't. Most threat actors are coming on and dropping on or trying to drop on disk mimikatz.exe. Or if they do a variant, they'll call it like mimi.exe. So threat actors are doing the same things to gain credentials. They're not really being all that creative. So anytime somebody says to you, a sophisticated threat actor used Mimikatz, I just want you to raise your eyebrow at that threat report. All right, just look at it and go, I don't know. But the difference between those threat reports and the ones that Anton and I are telling you about is this one actually is interesting. And so I want to give your attention first to the one on the right, because I think this is just crazy. Okay, so we have a threat actor. They broke in, they did all kinds of interesting things, and then we needed to work out what this start.exe was. And it took me a good minute or two, right? Because we didn't have access to the original file that was on disk. Once we worked out what it was, so there is a tool called, and I'm sure there are people in chat, you're very clever and you know this. I didn't know this, I'd never seen this before. A tool called Zen Armor, which is a password recovery suite. And this doesn't just get you like one password. No, run in the right way. This gets you passwords for a myriad of things. So we're talking browser credentials, Wi-Fi. We're talking anything that could possibly store a credential. It was put on there and ZenArmor could get it. You didn't even have to pay for this tool. It had a trial. I don't know why more threat actors aren't abusing it, but this threat actor did. What was really interesting is this credential dump in this particular way had a lot of parallel with, I think it's pronounced Avios or Avios. I'm not too sure on pronunciation, but spelling, to the Avios ransomware group that I think Trend Micro had tracked maybe a year prior. So I'm not saying that this was the exact same group, but there was parallels in the way that they ran this, the naming that they gave to it. And that's what we kind of see with there's a echelon of threat actors that exist above the rest. I'm not trying to claim that they are sophisticated, but they're not just copy pasting from Hactrix or some generic runbook. They've got maybe a slightly more interesting and novel playbook. And on the idea of like threads beyond just hashes, Anton, tell us a little bit about what we're seeing on the left, man.
Yeah, the left one is interesting because this is a specific tool, I believe, from the name's escaping me, the Nearsoft. I think it's Nearsoft, the suite of tools. And they're actually recovering Wi-Fi passwords from the host. Why specifically they're targeting Wi-Fi passwords, I'm not 100% sure. It could be that they're hoping that those credentials are maybe shared across the network. That could be a thing. Or it's some kind of like initial access broker that just wants credentials, period. But we're seeing more and more of this. When I kind of started with Huntress and I was starting to look at these kinds of cases, I definitely saw a lot of credential access, but similar to the VPN dynamic, it was mostly your standard mimic hats, the reg dumping. But lately, in the last couple of months and weeks, we've been seeing them go after more credentials. Obviously, we see a lot of cookie theft, a lot of file share type scans, but things like Zen Armor and things like going after Wi-Fi passwords. I know it's not a new technique, but we've just been kind of seeing it a little bit more out there, more than I would expect. So this is a really interesting dynamic here. Typically, when we hear about like mimikatz and credential theft and things like that, Wi-Fi passwords aren't really the thing that we kind of associate that with, but it's definitely a trend that we've been observing more and more, at least like an unofficial trend. I don't have, empirical evidence for you, unfortunately, but more and more we're seeing this kind of thing. So if you do have your Wi-Fi passwords that are shared and they're shared for other accounts, definitely keep that in mind that the threat actors are targeting those as well.
And it's worth noting, like threat actors that are coming to steal everything they can, misconfigure things, create guest accounts, punch holes in firewalls. It speaks to the importance of actually recovering. I know a lot of folks who have intrusions believe that a password reset and a reimage gets them out of trouble. But if a threat actor's disabled or misconfigured something on your file, if they've stolen credentials beyond like what we could initially have comprehended, like recovery is really important. And we see it time and time again where folks who roll their own recovery are often reinfected within literally less than a week. And we're kind of having to tell them the sad story of, yes, okay, we told you about the intrusion, but you didn't recover the way that you thought you did. And so sometimes, yes, that is a reimage. Sometimes it's unfortunately you do have to actually roll and instigate your incident response process. And we do appreciate that that is expensive and it is complex. So at Huntress, we really do try to tell you when something is worth, hey, just rotate these credentials and you're fine. And when we say, actually, we really think you need to implement your incident response policy. And we try to be really appropriate with that. And we actually want to become even more appropriate with that, give some playbooks. Those are coming where we can say, okay, you've had this kind of infection. We would recommend you do these three things. We typically see threat actors do this, this, and this. I've never re-imaged a gateway device in this side of a decade, Anton. I don't know how difficult or easy that is, but I'm going to make an assumption it's near impossible.
Yeah, some kind of like DD command that you're fighting for your life not to mess up on that poor
I'm gonna just
device.
let me
Yeah,
have the
that,
show. I'm just like
yeah,
have the show. You rant it.
yeah. Just
But
you
look,
deal with it now.
I want to be respectful of time because we've got a load of questions coming in. But the thing that I want to sort of kick lateral movement off with is I'm going to be so real. Threat actors do lateral movement in the exact same ways every single time. I actually can't believe that they aren't more interesting. Like the actors just use the exact same tools again and again and again. They use the exact same techniques. And I'm convinced it's because their actors aren't very good at lateral movement. The techniques that we see are copy pasted literally from like hacking playbooks that are available online. And it's a mixture between well, most lateral movement is always abusing legitimate Windows functionality. Sometimes that can be folks just using RDP, PS exec. I'm going to count PS exec as Windows functionality. The other ways that we see is when they leverage Windows protocols wrapped around hacking tools. So I'm thinking things like Impacket, CrackMap exec, and exactly folks are pulling out living off the land. Those are kind of the two ways that we see lateral movement. And man, they're never interesting until they are. Anton, tell us about what we're seeing here, man.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting case of auto movement where on the left-hand side you can kind of see the prep for the lateral movement, right? They're doing the enumeration to kind of see what's available. They're running PS exec, they're opening up RDP ostensibly to move laterally with it. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing is actual commands from PS exec. Where they're actually using PSExec to enumerate the domain admins group. And I'm pretty sure this was actually on a domain controller. And this kind of speaks to maybe a little bit of a disappointing dynamic that we see in that we don't see a lot of failed lateral movement. I think that's a really interesting topic, right? Like when we hear about lateral movement, we kind of assume that it's going to be successful. And I really do wish that we saw a lot more failed attempts at lateral movement. So the workstation kind of says like, hey, you don't have this particular login right, or the time of day isn't right for this account to be logging in, or the password doesn't work. But unfortunately, we just don't see that at all, actually. So once the threat actor is kind of like inside your network, it becomes kind of like a less friction environment. There's very little stopping them from grabbing credentials and moving laterally, which is why when we start to see this kind of lateral movement, we will usually isolate the entire network just out of an abundance of caution for the most part. Because yeah, we just I wish we had, and this is actually probably if there's any like budding researchers out there, this might be an interesting kind of research topic to look at. Threat actors failing to move laterally. And again, I really wish we saw more of that in our environment, but we don't. Once a threat actor has a hold in the environment and has a set of credentials, especially as I mentioned earlier, if there are local admin credentials that are kind of shared across the network, there's just very little friction preventing them from moving laterally, from grabbing tools like PSExec, or even using RDP internally to move laterally. So this is a definite like unfortunate dynamic for sure.
Sorry, man, I was answering questions. Oh man, we had a whole load of folks giving great advice on how to re-image gateway devices. Really, really, really
Nice.
appreciate that. I
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Anton's got a gateway device that he plays around with, so maybe we'll have a look into that. But phew, yeah, I'm seeing people being like, "Oh man, like if you steal the credentials, you could go and do that." It's like the unfortunate thing, and Anton said it, that like we don't see threat actors fail when it comes to lateral movement. We see them fail at a lot of other things, but again, this is default Windows functionality. It's a little bit like a few years ago to try and stop a tool called Responder working. Everyone suggested that you switch off LLMNR. I think it's the initials. But essentially, it's just you turned a tool called Responder on it, grabbed a hash, fantastic. And so some security consultants were like, "Oh, we'll turn it off. Here you go. Here's £100,000 bill." The problem with that is it used to break printers. And so you would switch off LLM because these consultants said so on a Friday. And then Monday morning, you've got people saying, "Hey, I can't print." So it's just being super careful when it comes to lateral movement mitigation. Like, don't just blindly deploy what folks say. I think here, the privilege of least principle is exactly what we would do. Exactly, Dino, harden Windows. So you want to
Mm.
create things that are hostile. I would say that doing things based on one, do you need to have east to west communication? So that means, do workstations need to talk to each other? Absolutely not. Workstations need to talk to servers and other things, but they don't need to talk to each other. Right, cool. Lock that down. Do you have, and someone else earlier said, "Hey, so are you suggesting we create admin accounts?" Depending on the infrastructure available, you can use things like PIM and PAM. So that's just-in-time administration. So if you right now, as an IT admin, your daily driving account is like the domain admin or the enterprise admin or the global admin, I would be grateful. If you would not do that,
Please.
create a separate account. Create a civilian account, if you will. Okay. And with your civilian account, what I'd quite like you to do is just do the normal civilian stuff. And then when you need your superpowers, go and use your IT admin, your domain admin, go and use those accounts. Because what we see is threat actors go and compromise the MSP account. When they break into a network, they are gunning for the MSP account because they know that that's going to give them the biggest bang for their buck. And I want to be respectful of time, so we're going to keep trucking. But Anton, we've scared them enough. And I'm seeing some people be like, "Hey, cool. So I," Anika's like, "Hey, so root is your daily driver. Hey, listen, this advice is only for Windows world. Linux is a completely different game. Okay. You have to get anything done there." Um, we've scared folks enough, and we've been really grateful that in the chat, folks have been sharing tips, and we've got questions that we're going to go through that give more tips. But Anton, I don't want people to leave here feeling like they have to go and purchase a very expensive zero trust solution. I see some people in the chat referencing competitors and what they do and don't have. Man, like different folks have different products that serve different purposes. I don't want this Tradecraft Tuesday to be about what Huntress sells and what we don't sell. What I want to do is give some tips and share some advice that is free, or at least you're not going to pay Huntress for, because I don't want that. It shouldn't be that security is pay to play. So a renewed focus on the basics. I completely agree with that. Like I completely agree that like sometimes interesting tradecraft and threat reports and security consultants can make people think about some of the more advanced stuff. But we got to go back to basics, because what you and I see again and again and again is threat actors don't win through sophistication. They win through gaps in our foundations. What do you think about that, man?
I completely agree. And I think that kind of like dovetails into the second point. And you kind of touched on it too with the disabling of LLM and R. And I believe that broke Max too. Uh, so definitely like, and this is something I definitely learned from my purple teaming days with the SSH kind of anecdote that I shared, is assume nothing. So if you think that something is configured a certain way in your network and you think like, okay, yeah, I disabled MFA for that executive, and someone, you assume that someone will turn it back on. Definitely do not test your assumptions, because all this is complex. It sounds pretty easy when we have nice screenshots for you and when we're talking about this kind of thing. But if you're actually in charge of a production network that has, different functionalities and different users and different requirements and different compliance regulations and all that, this kind of stuff is hard. Hardening your network, hardening your perimeter, using something. I saw a question in the chat about laps. Laps is fantastic. Yes, it would make lateral movement harder, but all these kinds of things rely on you kind of testing it and not assuming that it just works. So that all that is super, super important.
And don't lose focus. I thought that was an interesting one. I feel like that comes back to like, don't get confused by all of the buzzword. And like Brandon already called that out in chat. He's like, hey, thank you. Like, thanks for going over TTPs. Don't just screaming buzzwords, AI, zero trust. So I'm going to be honest with you. And this is just a litmus test that I do when I want to attend a webinar. If I see anything peddling AI, blockchain, zero trust, I kind of believe in zero trust. I kind of don't. If it's selling me that, if it's telling me about that, I'm going to assume the people talking either don't know what they're talking about, or worse, they do know what they're talking about and they're shilling. At the end of the day, AI is, you can't purchase your way through AI into good security. What you can do is enrich another company with your security budget if you go and purchase that nonsense. AI, ML, LLMs, they have a place. I don't believe it's for these kind of security conversations. I think what we're talking about here is good, honest security work that does require a budget, yes, but it doesn't require the kind of budget that these very expensive solutions would give you. On top of that, everybody wants to focus on the more sophisticated ODAs and elite threat actors that are doing all kinds of nation state sponsored things. I would say that read those, find them cool. Don't use those as your North Star. And I saw some folks talking in chat about frameworks. I love frameworks. I think they're fantastic, but I would encourage you to not beat yourself up if you can't completely adhere to the framework. All you need to do is harden your perimeter, your external perimeter and your internal perimeter. So harden your external perimeter. Focus on that. That's your number one thing to focus on. After that, you can start to think about the internal, right? But when I say external, I'm talking about email. How are you making sure that email and your users are pretty protected? There are lots of expensive solutions you can buy. Just train them. I know I'm saying just, but like just it's just cheaper. In the long term, it is just cheaper because you're going to buy a protection and then threat actors are going to find new ways to get them across. It used to be macros, then it was CACBOT with zips and ISOs. Now we're seeing threat actors leverage Teams messages to get your users. You're going to have to purchase 101 different things to block all of these external perimeter things. Or you can just train your users, man. Like, and users are users. I know I was a sysadmin, but like long term, that's cheaper. You can create a better security environment as well because you can make security everybody's responsibility. But you're not going to be able to focus on those things if you're busy being misled about what AI could do for you. That's all I have to say on that matter. Anton, expose thoughtfully. I like that because we talked about VPN and RDP. I'm like, is it 50% now? 50% of all the intrusions we see are
Yeah,
based on
that's wild.
things being exposed unthoughtfully.
Yeah. Like I said earlier, it's just a thing that we see way too much of, and that we would love to see less of. Exposed perimeters. But yeah, the whole thoughtfully piece here is super important, because you often hear advice, like don't expose VPN, don't expose RDP, lock down this, lock down that. Okay, but like, how are you supposed to work? Like at the end of the day, someone has to access a system remotely, potentially to enable the business, to enable the functionality of your actual network, right? That's what it's there for. It's not there to kind of just sit behind a firewall that doesn't allow any connections in or out or whatsoever, right? That doesn't make a functional network. So rather than telling you to, don't expose this, don't expose that, expose it thoughtfully, have an inventory of it, double check that what you are thinking is exposed is actually what's exposed. The amount of times that we have presented a partner with telemetry saying like, hey, you were breached through a VPN or your remote desktop gateway or something like that. And we were told, oh, we didn't know that it was enabled. That happens so many times, and it's so frustrating from both like a personal and professional level, right? Because it sucks that you had an assumption for something and that assumption turned out to be incorrect. And then that kind of led to potentially the worst day of your life, right? You get ransomed. It sucks. No, nobody wants to see that. So definitely expose. We're all professional security people here. We understand that things need to be exposed, that there is some risk involved, right? Security isn't about eliminating risk altogether, right? It's about managing that risk. So that's what the expose thoughtfully bullet point is kind of meant to convey, to really think about this. Think about what you're exposing, double check that you're exposing what you think you're exposing, because those two things could differ very drastically.
And I love this last one, man, about thinking like an attacker. Think like an attacker. And there's that classic, attackers, is it defenders thinking lists, attackers thinking graphs or something like that? I don't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that
I love
philosophy
that too.
definition. But what I
Yeah,
can tell you is you become a better defender when you're able to understand how threat actors operate. The other thing that's worth remembering is threat actors tools actually work differently on the defense side, like in terms of monitoring and detection. So running a tool means, okay, you know how to run it. Cool, fantastic. But seeing it on the defense side, really good example of this is Impacket. Um, by understanding how threat actors think, you're not just going to be able to look at your network and go, okay, this is where they'd attack. You'll literally be able to create detections and monitor things with a more intimate understanding. Anton, take us home on that thought as well about thinking like an attacker, and then we'll get to some questions.
yeah. I think that whole dynamic of labeling an endpoint unimportant, just because it doesn't have sensitive data on it, I think that kind of leads into this thinking like an attacker. Like really think about it. Like if you were to get credentials from this endpoint, what else could you access with those credentials? Where are kind of like the quote unquote skeletons in the closet in your network? Really think about all that kind of stuff, because I found that this kind of framework of thinking about your network really gets the defensive juices flowing. So even though you're thinking like an attacker, you're also thinking about your own personal network, right? And how you could defend it. So thinking about how you would move laterally in your own network could really spur some interesting ideas. So that's kind of I guess what I'll leave everyone with.
I couldn't find my mute. Cool, right. So, folks, listen, thank you so much. Huntress is going to be in some places. We'll catch you there. We're going to be in Chicago, Denver, Boston, Detroit. It's going to be great. We've also got our next Tradecraft Tuesday coming up. This is fantastic, man. Like, so for folks that don't know, Patrick and Stuart are like some of the first like thinkers of Mac OS security in the last couple of years. Patrick is a great author, writes fantastic stuff, and Stuart is just a thinker. He just thinks and he does. And Stuart works here. He's one of ours, okay, which is fantastic. And he's leading macOS. It's great. It's wonderful, and you should come to that. There's also going to be a survey about future Tradecraft Tuesdays. Come and check that out. I think I'd really appreciate if you filled that out. But look, we want to fill some time in with questions. We appreciate folks might have come here for their lunch. But what we're going to do is we're just going to go through some questions. Let me pull up the Q&A. Q&A has disappeared. There we go.
Actually, a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone.
And I'm
That's
super grateful
that's
for that as
amazing.
well.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
the chat has just been so wonderful. There's been such a sharing like space, and there's been no tariffs so far. So I'm grateful for
Zero
that. Hey, if
times.
folks have further questions, throw them in the Q&A. I'd love to get started firstly. We'll go and we'll ask some easy ones. Folks are saying, hey, are there recordings? Where's the archive? So this will be recorded. You can watch it at 1.2 times, Jesus, 1.5 times speed. You can just mute when I talk. I'm not that interesting. Anton's the real one there. And we've also had some folks be like, hey, is there like an archive of Tradecraft Tuesdays? To my understanding, I'm pretty sure if you go onto our Tradecraft Tuesday part of the blog, you can scroll down and it will have it there. That was when I last looked at it. I'm going to be honest, I don't check out that all that often. So if I'm wrong, send me hate mail on LinkedIn. Okay. Right, let's keep trucking. Oh, we've got some product questions being like, hey, is Huntress planning to do allow listing? Is Huntress planning to? So allow listing for applications isn't something that I'm too intimate on, but I do see us asking about, hey, so is Huntress planning to use external recon to elevate alerts and escalations? So for folks that aren't too sure, external recon is where we take a look at your external perimeter. We leverage various things to work out which ports are exposed and services are exposed. I believe that there is an ambition to plumb or elevate that in with SIM. so that we're able to sort of have a more mature conversation around ports and things like that that shouldn't and should be exposed. We don't want to tell you when you've got, I don't know, like your VPN exposed to the internet because that's where your VPN's kind of supposed to be. But we probably want to let you know where you've got SMB, Kerberos, and LDAP, which we see an unfortunate amount of. Let's keep looking. Oh man, that's a really interesting one. So Anton, Kevin's like, hey man, should we disable SSL VPN completely? Force IPsec with a pre-shared key or cert? Is there a more secure way to implement VPN to remote workers? What do you think, man?
So yeah, that's interesting. I think on the surface of it, the quick answer, yes, I think that would be more secure. But it depends on how you're authenticating to that IPsec. If it's like a cert that's on an endpoint and that endpoint isn't secure, then that might be a gap. So hard to answer that question fully, but on the surface of it, just the versus comparison kind of thing, yes, definitely a IPsec would be more would offer you more potential for security. I'll leave it at that because it definitely depends on how you configure it, where that cert is stored, how the authentication happens. So short answer, yes. Longer answer, it definitely depends.
I love that it depends is always like the most sophisticated answer. I'm going to keep trucking. How often do you see threat actors try to disable EDR solutions? How often are they successful? Oh, Corey, man. So we see them try a lot. Threat actors that we see anyway. There's two quick ways that they'll try. One is they'll just try and uninstall the EDR. You would be surprised at how successful threat actors can be. The other that we see is they try to create network roadblocks. So what I mean by that is they'll try to manipulate DNS, they'll try to create particular firewall rules that just stop network telemetry being evaporated up into the EDR's server-side vacuum. Most threat actors aren't even trying to do any of that, to be perfectly honest with you. Most threat actors, the most sophisticated defense evasion that they do is to disable Defender. That's it. So there are threat actors that do try to disable EDR solutions, medium successful, but they are not the routine. The routine is that most threat actors are just disabling Defender and they're kind of done with it up to that. Let's keep going. What other questions there? Hey, would you recommend logging on a local workstation to perform administrative tasks? Logging on to a local workstation to perform administrative tasks.
So I think, yeah, there's two, yeah, from Carl, there's two questions. So the standard kind of answer to all this local admin usage is like the 3-tier model. If you Google that, Microsoft has a whole bunch of documentations on it. But basically what you want to do is just make sure, and you can do this via GPO, to make sure that your local admin accounts are segregated. So the one set of local admin accounts could work only for your workstations. The other set works for your servers. And then there's another set that only works for the domain controllers. And if you do that, then that means if your local admin password is compromised from a workstation, the threat actor could potentially go to other workstations, but they can't hop to a server and they can't hop to a domain controller. So you're kind of limiting that blast radius there. And then if you're implementing firewall controls on top of that, then you're just really, really limiting the impact of stolen credentials. So yes, those credentials might get stolen, but what you could actually do with those stolen credentials from a threat actor perspective is severely, severely limited if you use GPOs properly and if you use firewalls properly. So yeah, great question, Carl. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm loving these questions. So we've got one here that says, hey
Yeah,
man, on
fantastic.
remote access gateway topic or MFA in general, are there thoughts on MFA requests before or after the password request? If you ask for it before the password, there's a risk of brute forcing 999 numbers. If they have a valid password they've acquired elsewhere versus brute forcing a password, then brute forcing 999 in 30 seconds or less. Basically, what is the best way to implement MFA? So the number one thing that I would say is you want to make sure that user exhaustion isn't connected to how you do your MFA implementation. So a while ago, you could have MFAs that just did pushes to a user's app saying, hey, you're trying to authenticate. There have been not many, but a handful of intrusions where users just went, fuck it, and press yes. Yes, I am trying to authenticate. So you don't want to implement a solution like that. But I think that's a really interesting one, being like, hey, man, so if you put MFA first, does that undermine the chances of a threat actor breaking in? I want to answer that, but I do want to say one thing. MFA can be bypassed. MFA can be bypassed, and more research has been done in the identity mail world. So, yes, it can be bypassed, and there are various ways to replay tokens and things like that. The other thing I'd say is we've observed a couple times where MFA has been misconfigured for on-prem stuff that folks are exposing. And I would really encourage folks before you over rotate on trying to put MFA on something that maybe would be best put behind a firewall. You just have a meditation and be like, hey, can I just throw this behind a firewall, throw it behind the VPN? Because we see again and again trying to force MFA onto what I'm going to call tech, legacy tech, including protocols like RDP. We really wouldn't recommend it. But Anton, what do you think about that, man? Like the philosophy of MFA first and then password, or password then MFA?
Yeah, that's an interesting one for sure. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. I'd probably have to do a little bit of reading. I think probably more, maybe not more important, but maybe just as important is having the procedures down. I've seen that a lot, not so much here, but in previous roles where you're kind of like first line defense for this kind of stuff is service desk staff, and they are often kind of like not equipped to handle like the full procedure end to end, to know when to ask for certain information and things like that. So very, very good question. I don't have a good answer for you off the top of your head, off the top of my head, excuse me. But um, the fact that the question's even being asked and the fact that that's where your head is at is a good omen to me. So whatever you're doing, you're definitely on the right track. There's another
It's a
question
matter.
here,
Oh,
Samuel or LDAP. Oh, sorry, Jay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's one of those like matter of philosophy, matter of taste things, as opposed to
Yeah.
is one right or the other. It's that. But sorry, go on. You carry on cooking.
No, no, it's all good. Yeah, there's a question here, SAML or LDAP no way for VPN. I assume you're asking for this is for like integration with your VPN for your network. I think either is fine. If you have the option to use Kerberos, I'd probably use that. The thing to watch out for LDAP, and that doesn't really matter so much externally, but internally, if you're using the regular LDAP, like the port 363 LDAP or whatever it is, that's all clear text. So just keep that in mind. If you're using LDAP, choose LDAP S. And if you have the option to use Kerberos for your VPN connection to your AD, definitely use that instead.
Uh, cool. Go there. Hey, we got something like, hey man, what tools should you think someone should look into to learn if they want to be more creative at red teaming but still useful to clients? I'm gonna focus on that last part. Um, MITRE ATT&CK has a great, I think it's called the MAD course, and I don't remember exactly which module it is in the MAD course, but essentially it talks about like when you want to be useful for adversary emulation, you go and do some research on your company, the company that's paying you, what industry they're in, and then you go and look at comparable threat actors that target those industries, and you adjust your TTPs to be like that. And the other thing that I'd say is I have a wonderful relation with my red team colleagues. I have a wonderful understanding of the defensive world and a little bit, of the red team world. And something that I've noticed with my red team colleagues, they understand a tool and all its modularities, but they sometimes don't understand threat actors. And as blue team, as Anton and I do, and what we see time and time again is threat actors use tools in one way, usually a very default way. We'll say Cobalt Strike as an example. And red teams, offensive security experts, use Cobalt Strike and those tools in a completely different way that almost mean we're not having the same conversation. And so if I hold up my hand and say threat actors are using Cobalt Strike in this particular way with this particular profile, I'll have my offensive security folks saying, hey, I am in a completely different headspace than that. That is not how I use it or anyone that I know uses it. So all I would encourage is if folks are looking to get into red teaming offensive security, depending on how you want to do this, I would really try to actually emulate adversaries rather than extend a red team repertoire of doing offensive security. It's not that that isn't valuable. It's just if you're trying to do adversary emulation, you actually have to study real life threat actors rather than extend tool modularity. But you've got someone on the conversation who used to get paid to do this kind of thing for a living. Anton, as someone who was part of that purple team world, what would you advise the anonymous attendee to do to want to be more creative at red teaming but still useful?
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely an interesting one. I think you hit it on the head there. I think it all depends on what the client wants. Some clients want to be wowed with the red team tools and red team techniques and stuff, and other clients want to, what Dre mentioned, have a replication of a kill chain that resembles a particular threat actor. So I think generally I would say focus less on the tools and focus more, and then I think Dre focused on this too, is focus more on the second part of the question, the value to the clients, and that's all done at the sal phase, right, before you actually start the engagement. So that would be, my advice there.
Oh, and we've got a spicy one to end. And before we even get to the spicy one, I'll say, Anika, yeah, no, for sure. Red teamers, they've got perspectives, man. They've got lots of perspectives. And all I remind them is like, hey, I see threat data, so I'm going to speak from threat data. I don't study the modularity of tools, so you can talk about modularity of tools. And we'll both stay in our lanes and we'll come together when we need to. But other than that, you stay to your side of Twitter, I'll stay to mine. We've got Kevin being like, so you're saying Duo for an RDP server isn't recommended. So Kevin, earlier in the webinar, I referenced that we'd seen a couple times where MFA for RDP and other external services had failed. And I'm not here to comment on Duo. I'm not here to comment on Duo's efficacy. What I am here to say is often documentation that we've then read to be like, well, yeah, because how is a partner telling us they've implemented it? They're not stupid, and we're seeing that this MFA is enabled. So what's going on here? The documentation has made it clear that if you don't follow a very careful and cultivated choreography, you will not, in fact, have MFA security. You will have the inconvenience of your user typing things in that they need to get into, but if not set up appropriately, MFA for RDP, from everything that I have observed, isn't a thing. It's just not a sure thing. It's not like if you're doing MFA for email identity, where that's a pretty, yeah, sure, you've got token theft, but actually like misconfiguring that MFA is quite hard to do. We just see time and time again that the juice is not worth the squeeze to try and force legacy RDP, SMB, we've seen a couple of times, to work with MFA. That's just my perspective on that. Anton, would you reckon?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that goes back to the last points that we were making in the slides. Like, don't assume anything and test. Uh, I think, yeah, in the chat, that's definitely a dynamic that we've seen, Edward, having the confusion around fail open versus fail secure, and exactly what happens if the Duo service happens to crash, or things like that. Or it's not in any way taking undue. I think this is just a thing that happens with any kind of software-based MFA. I don't know the proper terminology for this, or agent-based MFA maybe. There's nothing in security as in life that's like purely black and white like this. It's just a matter of understanding the gaps, understanding the risks, and understanding how that MFA functions if you poke at it a little bit, or if the service kind of dies on you.
And then the last one, have you seen any TAs disabling the Huntress agent via WDAC, creating a policy? No, not yet. So I did see somebody talking about this literally the other day for evading EDRs. I actually wonder if the juice isn't worth the squeeze to try and do all of that. Like you really would be, if I was a threat actor, I'm just gonna mess with your network telemetry. That's just it, because it's just easier. Like no one is doing client-side EDRs because that just doesn't make sense. Like you have to vacuum things up server side. So just mess with the network telemetry. What do you reckon, Anton?
Yeah, I think yeah, for those who don't know, WADAC is like Windows Defender Application Control. So it's a way to tell Windows what's allowed and what not allowed to run on your system. And the question is whether that functionality could be used kind of like against the Huntress agent to stop it. No, we haven't seen that too much. Although, having said that, watch next week. We'll get a whole bunch of signals with it, but I hope not. But yeah, I think like as we've seen with this kind of tradecraft, and as we've seen kind of with the general theme of this presentation, threat actors will take the least friction approach. Kind of like water flowing down a hill. It won't go uphill. It'll go down. It'll take the path that's open to it. And that's exactly what we've observed with threat actors. They'll do whatever is the easiest common denominator for them to do. They'll do that. So things like WADAC, I think it's a cool TTP. Like I'd be interested in it from like a consulting perspective. The purple team is definitely something to try, definitely something to see if your tools pick up. But yeah, we haven't observed too much of it.
Oh, fantastic. So look, this has been a great, great webinar. I really appreciate that folks have been really engaged and
Yeah,
I
thank
just
you.
love scrolling through the chat and just seeing how like committed and how much people care. Again, like the conversation doesn't have to end here. Folks are welcome to reach out to us on LinkedIn, on Twitter. A couple people have asked for some requests. So I saw that a gentleman called Howard was like, hey, would you be able to send me a screenshot of what this kind of report looks like? We've tracked all of that. Jamie Levy in the chat has done an absolutely fantastic job of keeping track of that. We're going to go and get that to you. If for whatever reason you don't hear from us, drop me a message on LinkedIn being like, hey, I was in that webinar. I wanted this resource. We will go and get that for you. Anton, thank you so much, man. So for folks that don't know, Anton is a wonderful writer. He drops a billion blogs that are just fantastic. He's shared them at Huntress, but also if you go into Anton's archives, he's written amazing stuff to do with cloud securing and ingesting logs there and making sense of them. So go and check out everything that he's written, everything he ever does. Anton is also a superstar now. He's also a movie star. You can find him on YouTube. And you can go and check out some videos where Anton is talking you through how the SOC and how tactical response at the Huntress does their thing and investigates intrusion. So there's lots of Huntress material to engage in for free. We won't even charge you, no tariffs. But thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Anton. Thank you for your time, man.
Thank you, everyone. That was a blast.